The first thing you should know is that the restaurant wasn't even my choice. My mom picked it because it was nice enough for a celebration, but not so nice that she felt uncomfortable bringing up how expensive everything was going to be. White tablecloths, soft lighting, waiters who refilled your water without asking. The kind of place where you feel like something important is supposed to happen. I remember sitting there with my hands folded in my lap, my graduation cap tucked awkwardly under the chair, trying to convince myself that this dinner was actually about me. My name is Eddie. I was 22 years old that night, freshly graduated, still riding the strange mix of relief and exhaustion that comes from finishing something you've been working toward for years. I kept telling myself, just get through tonight. Smile. Say thank you. Don't expect too much. That was always the trick with my family. Don't expect too much, and you won't be disappointed. Except I'd been disappointing myself for years by pretending not to notice the pattern. My sister Lily sat across from me, relaxed, confident, already halfway through a story about a presentation she'd given at work. My parents leaned in when she spoke. They laughed at the right moments. My dad nodded like everything she said confirmed something he'd always known. When I spoke, even casually, there was a delay. A half-second pause where they decided whether it was worth engaging with. Usually it wasn't. This wasn't new. Growing up, Lily had been the spark. The kid teachers remembered. The one relatives bragged about at holidays. I was the quiet one. The dependable one. The one who didn't cause problems, which somehow translated into the one who didn't need attention. When Lily won something, it was framed and hung. When I did well, it was acknowledged with a quick, "That's nice," before the conversation drifted somewhere else. Over time, I learned how to shrink my expectations. I learned how to clap loudly for her achievements and swallow the small ache that came with realizing no one was clapping for mine. At the restaurant, the waiter took our drink orders, and my mom waved him off when he asked if we were celebrating anything special. "Oh, just a little family dinner," she said, smiling politely. "Not graduation dinner. Not my graduation dinner. Just a family dinner." I noticed it, the way I always did, like a pinprick under the skin. Small. Easy to ignore if you'd had enough practice. Conversation flowed around me. Lily talked about her job. My dad asked follow-up questions. My mom chimed in with little additions, reminding everyone of how Lily had always been driven and focused. At one point, my mom glanced at me and said, "And Eddie's finally done with school too." The way someone might mention the weather. No question, no curiosity, just a fact tossed into the air and left to fall wherever it landed. I nodded and smiled, because that's what I'd trained myself to do. Inside, though, there was a quiet tightening. Not anger. Not yet. Just the familiar sense of being slightly out of place at a table I technically belonged at. When the food arrived, my dad stood up. He cleared his throat and tapped his glass with the back of his fork. The sound cut through the low hum of the restaurant, and nearby tables glanced over politely. My first thought was, oh, this is it. This is the moment. My chest lifted with something dangerously close to hope. "I just want to say a few words," my dad began. He smiled, the proud kind of smile he saved for public moments. "We don't get together like this often enough." My mom reached for her own glass and tapped it too, like she couldn't wait. "Yes," she said, already beaming. "I actually wanted to say something as well." They stood there together, my parents, framed by soft lighting and clinking silverware, and I sat frozen, hands still folded, heart beating a little faster than it should have. This was supposed to be my night. I reminded myself not to read too much into it. Don't expect too much. My mom started speaking. "You know," she said, looking around the table. "When Lily was little, we always knew she was going to go far. There was just something about her. That spark. That confidence. Teachers would tell us, 'This kid is special.'" Lily laughed softly, the modest kind of laugh that still accepted the praise. My dad nodded along. "This is the kid we always knew would go far," my mom continued, tapping her glass again for emphasis. "She's worked so hard, and it's amazing to see her thriving the way she is." There was applause. Actual applause. My dad clapped first, then Lily, then my mom, and then a few nearby tables joined in because that's what people do when they hear clapping. I joined too, because my hands moved on instinct. I clapped for my sister, smiling, feeling something settle heavy in my stomach. The speech went on. My dad added his own remarks about how proud they were, how Lily had always had a plan, how she'd made smart choices. It was a highlight reel I'd heard versions of my entire life. What stung wasn't the praise itself. Lily had earned her success. What stung was the silence around me. The empty space where my name could have been mentioned and wasn't. When the applause finally faded, my mom sat down, clearly satisfied. She took a sip of her drink and leaned toward Lily to say something quietly. No one looked at me. No one asked how graduation felt. No one asked what came next. I felt strangely calm. Not numb. Calm. In the way you get when something finally confirms what you've been trying not to see. The waiter came back to check on us, and I thanked him automatically. My fork rested untouched on my plate. In my jacket pocket, I felt the edge of an envelope. Thick. Cream-colored. I checked 3 times before we left the house to make sure it was there. I hadn't planned to bring it originally, but something told me I should. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was years of being overlooked, quietly preparing me for moments like this. My dad was mid-sentence again, talking about how important it was to recognize potential early. My mom nodded along, already crafting her next thought. Lily smiled, comfortable, secure in her place at the center of their attention. I waited. I let them finish. I let the last of the applause die completely. I let the restaurant settle back into its low hum. Then, slowly, deliberately, I reached into my jacket pocket and slid the envelope out onto the table. The paper made a soft sound against the tablecloth, barely noticeable. But my mom's eyes flicked down anyway. My dad paused mid-word. Lily's smile faltered, just a fraction, as she glanced from the envelope to me. I forgot to mention something, I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I didn't open it yet. I just rested my hand on top of it and looked up at them, one by one, feeling the weight of years pressing into that single moment. That was when the table finally went quiet. For a moment after I said that, nobody spoke. It was one of those silences that feels louder than conversation, the kind that makes you aware of every tiny sound. The clink of cutlery from a nearby table, the low murmur of a couple arguing quietly behind us, the hum of the air conditioning. My hand was still resting on the envelope, not opening it, not sliding it forward, just letting it exist there between us like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. My mom was the first to recover. She smiled, the polite, hosting a dinner smile, not the proud one she'd just used on Lily. "Oh," she said lightly. "What's that, Eddie?" There it was. Not what is it? Not is this about your graduation? Just oh, like I'd pulled out a receipt or a coupon. I felt something tighten in my chest, but I kept my tone even. "It's an acceptance letter," I said. "From a graduate program." My dad blinked. "Graduate program?" he repeated, as if the words didn't quite fit together. "I thought you were just finishing." "I am," I said. "This is what comes next." Lily tilted her head, studying the envelope like it was a prop she hadn't been told about in advance. "You applied already?" she asked. Not impressed, not curious, just surprised that I'd done something without announcing it. "Yeah," I said. "A while ago." My mom waved her hand slightly, like she was brushing past the detail. "Well, open it then," she said. "Let's see." I hesitated. Not because I was unsure of what was inside. I'd read it so many times I could practically recite it, but because something in me wanted to slow the moment down, to make them sit with the fact that this existed whether they were interested or not. Eventually, I slid my finger under the flap and pulled the letter out. "I was accepted," I said. "Fully funded." That got a reaction. My dad straightened in his chair. "Fully funded?" he said, louder than necessary. "Yes," I replied. "Tuition, stipend, housing assistance. The whole program." My mom frowned, not in disbelief, but in calculation. "Well," she said slowly, "that's nice." Nice. The word landed flat. I waited, foolishly, for more. For a question. For excitement. For anything resembling the energy they'd just poured into Lily. Instead, my dad leaned back and crossed his arms. "So what is it?" he asked. "Like, where is it?" I told them the name of the program, the university, the city. I explained what I'd be studying, why it mattered to me, how competitive it was. I watched their faces as I spoke, looking for some sign that this was registering as important. My dad nodded occasionally, the way he did when someone was explaining something he didn't plan to remember. My mom glanced at Lily halfway through, as if checking whether this was interesting enough to keep listening. When I finished, there was another pause. Then my mom said, "Well, that's good. I just wish you'd told us earlier. We could have helped." Helped? I almost laughed. Almost. "I did tell you," I said quietly. She blinked. When? Last year, I replied. When I mentioned I was applying. At Thanksgiving. And again in the spring, when I said I had interviews. My mom's lips pressed together. I don't remember that. I do, I said. My dad shrugged. You probably didn't explain it very clearly, he said. You know how you are. There it was. The subtle blame shift. The implication that if they missed something important about my life, it was because I hadn't packaged it correctly. Lily smiled faintly, not unkindly, but with that familiar expression that said this wasn't her problem. Well, my mom said, clapping her hands softly as if to reset the mood. That's all very exciting. Anyway, she turned to Lily again. Tell your dad about what your manager said today. Just like that, the moment was over. Or rather, it was taken from me and shelved. Conversation flowed back to my sister's life, her plans, her future. My acceptance letter sat on the table between my plate and my glass, untouched, unread by anyone but me. Something in me shifted then. It wasn't dramatic. No explosion. Just a quiet realization that this wasn't an accident or a one-off. This was the shape of things. And it wasn't going to change just because I'd achieved something objectively impressive. Over the next few weeks, that realization hardened. Graduation came and went. My parents attended the ceremony, sat through my name being called, clapped politely. Afterward, my mom hugged me and said, "We're proud of you." The way you say it when it's expected, not because you're bursting too. There was no party, no gathering, no extended family calls. Lily had a brunch planned when she got her promotion. Balloons, photos, a cake with her name on it. I moved back home temporarily to save money before the program started. That was my first mistake. Living under their roof again was like stepping back into an old version of myself I thought I'd outgrown. My parents didn't charge Lily rent when she'd lived there after college. For me, they sat me down the first week and explained responsibilities. A monthly contribution, groceries, utilities. Just until you get settled, my dad said. It's important you learn how the real world works. Lily dropped by often. She'd sprawl on the couch, kick off her shoes, complain about work. My mom would listen intently, offer advice, validate every frustration. When I mentioned being stressed about paperwork for the program, my dad said, "Well, you chose this path." The favoritism wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It lived in small things. In who got asked about their day. In whose opinions mattered. In who was trusted. One afternoon, I overheard my parents in the kitchen talking about finances. My mom's voice was low but tense. "We can't keep covering her expenses," she said. I froze in the hallway, heart pounding, assuming they meant me. My dad sighed. "I know, but she's got potential. It's an investment." She, not me. Later that night, Lily mentioned casually that our parents were helping her with a down payment on a condo. "Just a loan," she said breezily. "To get me started." I stared at her. "They are?" "Yeah," she said. "I mean, they offered. They said it makes sense to support the kid who's staying local." I didn't say anything. I went to my room and sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall. I thought about my stipend, modest but earned. I thought about how I'd never asked them for money, never expected it. And yet somehow, I was the burden. The breaking point didn't come all at once. It built, day by day, comment by comment, until the weight of it was impossible to ignore. It came the night my parents hosted a small dinner with relatives. Nothing fancy, just family. I hadn't been told ahead of time that it was happening. I found out when I walked into the living room and saw coats piled on the chair and heard voices from the dining area. "Oh, Eddie," my mom said when she saw me. "You're home. Good. You can help bring out the food." During dinner, the conversation turned, as it always did, to Lily. Her condo, her job, her future plans. An aunt leaned over and said, "Your parents must be so proud." They smiled. They nodded. They soaked it in. At one point, my uncle asked, "So what are you up to these days, Eddie?" Before I could answer, my dad said, "He's going back to school." "Oh," my uncle said, eyebrows raised. "Still." I opened my mouth to explain. My mom cut in. "It's one of those academic things," she said. "We'll see how it goes." Something snapped then. Not outwardly. Inside. After dinner, as people were finishing dessert, my mom stood up and tapped her glass again. The same gesture as the graduation dinner. The same practiced smile. "I just want to say," she began, "how grateful we are to have such a successful daughter. Lily has really stepped up this year, and we couldn't be prouder of the life she's building." Applause. Again. Familiar. Predictable. Then she added, without looking at me. And of course, Eddie is figuring things out. Laughter. Not cruel, but careless. I felt heat rush to my face. My hands clenched under the table. I waited. I let the applause fade. I let the room settle. Then my aunt said, cheerfully, well, not everyone can be a star, right? That was the moment. The exact second everything changed. I pushed my chair back slightly and stood. My heart was racing, but my voice, when I spoke, was calm. I think there's something you should all know, I said. The room went quiet. My mom looked startled. My dad frowned, already annoyed. Lily's smile disappeared entirely. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder this time, thicker than the envelope from the restaurant. I hadn't planned to bring it, but something told me, again, that I should. This, I said, placing it on the table, is the offer letter, funding agreement, and contract for my program. It's fully funded for 5 years. Competitive. Nationally ranked. My mom waved her hand, flustered. Eddie, this isn't the time. I wasn't finished, I said. That shut her up. I didn't just figure things out. I continued. I planned. I worked. I got accepted into something you never once asked me about. And that's fine. But don't reduce it to a punchline. The silence was thick now. No polite clapping. No murmurs. Just shock. My dad stood up abruptly. You're embarrassing us, he hissed. That's when Lily spoke, her voice sharp. You always do this, she said. You turn everything into a competition. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized something painful and clarifying. She believed that. She genuinely thought my asking to be seen was an attack on her. Before I could respond, my mom said something that changed everything. You know, she said coldly, if you're so unhappy here, maybe you should rethink how much support you expect from this family. Support. From them. I felt something settle into place then. A final piece clicking into alignment. I nodded slowly. Okay, I said. Then you should know something else. I reached back into my bag, my fingers brushing against another document I hadn't intended to reveal yet. One that explained why I'd been so careful, so quiet, so prepared. I slid it halfway out, just enough for the header to be visible. My dad's eyes dropped to it. His face drained of color. What is that? He asked. I met his gaze, my pulse steady now. That, I said, is where things stop being the way you think they are. And before anyone could stop me, before anyone could speak, I pulled it the rest of the way into the light. The room didn't explode the way you might expect. There was no shouting match, no dramatic storming out. Instead, everything seemed to collapse inward. My dad stared at the document like it might rearrange itself if he waited long enough. My mom's mouth opened slightly, then closed. Lily looked between them, confused, irritated, already defensive. Eddie, my mom said finally, her voice tight, put that away. This isn't appropriate. I didn't argue. I didn't need to. I slid the document back into my bag and zipped it up slowly. The damage had already been done, even if they didn't yet understand how deep it went. Dinner ended shortly after. People made excuses. Chairs scraped. Plates were cleared too quickly. My aunt hugged me on her way out and whispered, "Good luck," in a tone that suggested she didn't really know what else to say. Lily avoided my eyes. My parents barely spoke to me. That night, after the house was quiet, my dad knocked on my bedroom door. He didn't wait for an answer. What was that? He demanded in a low voice. What were you trying to pull? I wasn't pulling anything, I said. I was telling the truth. He shook his head. You blindsided us. In front of everyone. You've been doing that to me for years, I replied. My voice surprised me again, steady, not shaking. I just finally stopped covering for it. My mom appeared behind him in the doorway. We've supported you, she said sharply. You didn't need to make a scene. Supported me how? I asked. She hesitated. That pause told me everything. The argument didn't go anywhere. It circled the same points it always had. How I was too sensitive. How Lily didn't mean anything by it. How families don't keep score. Eventually, my dad said, maybe it's time you moved out sooner than planned. That was it. No yelling. No apology. Just a quiet eviction disguised as concern. I packed the next morning. I moved into a small sublet near campus, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and thin walls. It smelled faintly of old coffee and dust. My stipend covered rent, barely. I bought groceries carefully, counted expenses, said no to things without explaining why. For the first time, I was completely on my own. And for the first few weeks, I was miserable. I'd wake up in the dark and stare at the ceiling, replaying conversations I wished I'd handled differently. I wondered if I'd overreacted, if I'd burned bridges unnecessarily. I missed the idea of family, even if I hadn't really had the version other people talked about. Some nights, I sat on the edge of the bed and felt the weight of everything pressed down so hard it was difficult to breathe. That was my rock bottom. Not poverty, not failure, just the quiet realization that I had stepped away from something I'd been clinging to out of habit, not love. What pulled me out of it wasn't some grand revelation. It was routine. Classes started. Real ones. The kind where professors remembered my name. The kind where people listened when I spoke. My advisor met with me weekly and asked questions about my ideas, not my sister's life, not my parents' expectations. My work mattered here. I mattered. I poured myself into it. Research. Reading. Long nights at the library. I stopped checking my phone for messages that weren't coming. When my mom texted once, "Just hope you're doing okay," I replied politely and didn't elaborate. When Lily sent a group message about her condo progress, I muted the thread. Slowly, something shifted. I started running in the mornings, not to get fit, but to burn off the static in my head. I cooked simple meals and learned which spices made cheap food taste better. I made friends who knew nothing about my family dynamic and didn't care. To them, I was just Eddie, the guy who showed up prepared, the one who followed through. Halfway through the semester, I was offered a paid research assistant position. Extra income, extra responsibility. My advisor told me, "You're doing exceptional work." I went home that night and sat on the floor of my apartment, stunned by how much those words meant when they came from someone who had no obligation to say them. I didn't tell my parents. Months passed. Winter came. Snow piled against the windows. My life narrowed and sharpened in a good way. I felt stronger, more centered, less reactive. The absence of constant comparison was like finally being able to breathe deeply. Then, one afternoon, I got a call from my dad. I let it ring twice before answering. "Hey," he said. His tone was different. "Careful. We need to talk." I leaned back in my chair. "About what?" There was a pause. "It's about Lily." My stomach tightened, but I didn't interrupt. "She's running into some issues," he continued. "With the condo. With money." I waited. "We might need your help," he said finally. "Just temporarily." There it was. The shift. The unspoken assumption that I would step in quietly, the way I always had. "I can't," I said. Silence. "You can't?" my dad repeated, incredulous. "No," I said calmly. "I can't." My mom took the phone then. "Eddie, sweetheart, this isn't about old grievances. This is family." I closed my eyes. Family didn't seem to apply when I needed support. She sighed, frustrated. "We're not doing this again." "I'm not either," I said. "I hope Lily figures it out. I really do. But I'm not your safety net." The call ended awkwardly. No shouting. No resolution. Just a new tension humming under everything. After that, the messages increased. Not just from my parents, but from extended family. Questions. Hints. Guilt disguised as concern. I responded less and less. I didn't explain myself. I didn't justify my choices. Instead, I focused forward. By the end of the year, I was publishing with my advisor. Conferences followed. Opportunities stacked quietly, one on top of another. I learned to measure my worth by my own standards, not by whether someone else noticed. One evening, as I was sorting through old files on my laptop, I came across a scanned copy of the document I'd almost revealed fully at that dinner months ago. The one that had made my dad's face go pale. I stared at it for a long time, remembering the moment I'd pulled it out, the way the room had shifted. I realized then that I hadn't done it out of spite. I'd done it because, on some level, I'd needed proof. Proof that I wasn't imagining things. Proof that the imbalance had consequences. And now, months later, I didn't need that proof anymore. What I didn't realize, what I couldn't yet see, was that my parents hadn't let it go. That Lily hadn't either. And that the document in my bag, the one I'd nearly revealed, was about to matter in a way none of us had anticipated. The rise had begun quietly. The fall had already happened. And somewhere, just beyond the edges of my carefully rebuilt life, the past was gathering itself for one more collision. I didn't wake up one morning and decide to take revenge. That's not how it happened. There was no dramatic vow, no mirror speech, no sudden switch flipping in my head. What happened instead was quieter, and in some ways more unsettling. I started noticing patterns. Little inconsistencies. Things that didn't add up unless you stopped assuming my parents were merely careless or biased and started considering that they were strategic when it suited them. The first clue came from an email that wasn't meant for me. It landed in my inbox late one night, forwarded accidentally by my mom, I think, because she'd meant to send it to Lily. The subject line was vague, something about documents for review. I almost ignored it, assuming it was another condo update or some family logistics thing I wasn't really part of anymore. But my name was mentioned in the body, just once, enough to make me open it. It was a thread between my parents and a financial advisor. My dad had written, "We need to make sure Eddie doesn't complicate this. He's been distant lately, but legally he's still listed." That was it. No context. No explanation. Just that line, sitting there like a loose wire. Listed as what? I didn't reply. I didn't confront them. I downloaded the email, saved it, and closed my laptop. That night, sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept circling back to that word. Listed. You don't use that word casually. Not when you're talking about money. The next day, instead of calling my parents, I called the university's legal clinic. It was meant for students dealing with housing disputes or contract questions, nothing dramatic. I framed it that way. I said I had some questions about family financial arrangements and wanted to understand my rights. The law student assigned to me listened carefully, asked me to bring in anything relevant. So I did. I brought the email. I brought old tax documents my dad had once casually asked me to scan for him years ago. I brought copies of forms I'd signed at 18 that I'd barely understood at the time. Things I'd forgotten existed because no one had ever encouraged me to think they mattered. Over the next few weeks, a picture started to form. It turned out that my parents had used my name more than once over the years. Not maliciously, they would say, just conveniently. A cosigner here, a placeholder there, an asset registered jointly because it simplified things. I had trusted them. I hadn't asked questions. Why would I? They were my parents. Meanwhile, Lily had benefited from those arrangements without ever being attached to the risk. She wasn't listed. She wasn't liable. She was just the recipient. The law student didn't tell me what to do. She didn't need to. She just explained what was true. You have standing, she said. More than you realize. I walked back to my apartment in a daze. The snow had melted, leaving the sidewalks wet and gray. Cars hissed past. People hurried along, wrapped in their own lives. I felt like I was carrying a secret that weighed more with every step. I still didn't feel angry. Not yet. What I felt was clarity. From that point on, I stopped reacting and started observing. When my mom called and tried to sound casual, asking how school was going, I answered politely and kept my responses short. When my dad emailed about updating paperwork, I said I was busy but would look at it later. I let them assume distance meant distraction, not preparation. At the same time, I started gathering allies, though I didn't think of them that way at first. My advisor introduced me to a senior faculty member who had industry connections. One conversation led to another. I accepted a consulting project that paid more than my stipend for a fraction of the time. I opened a separate savings account. I learned how to read contracts properly, not just skim them. I asked questions without apologizing. I also reconnected with my aunt, the one who had whispered, "Good luck," to me after that disastrous dinner. I invited her for coffee when she was in town. We talked about neutral things at first, then gradually about family. She hesitated before saying, "You know your parents have always leaned on you more than you realize." I nodded. I'm starting to understand that. She didn't ask for details. She didn't need them. But she started forwarding me things too. Old emails, group messages, comments that seemed harmless on the surface but revealed a lot when placed side by side. None of this felt like plotting. It felt like accounting, like finally balancing a ledger that had been off for years. The opportunity to act didn't come from me pushing. It came from them overreaching. Lily's condo situation deteriorated faster than anyone expected. The loan my parents had given her wasn't structured well. Interest rates shifted. Fees stacked up. Suddenly, what had been framed as a temporary boost became a long-term problem. My parents panicked quietly at first, then less quietly. That's when the tone of their messages changed. "We should all get on the same page," my dad wrote. "It's important we approach this as a family," my mom added. "Can you come home for a weekend? We need to talk things through," they said together. I agreed. Not because I wanted to fix things, but because it was finally time to stop pretending I didn't understand the rules of the game. I arrived on a Friday evening, bag in hand, expression neutral. The house looked the same. Same paint, same furniture, same subtle hierarchy in how space was occupied. Lily was already there, pacing, stressed, snapping at my mom over small things. She looked relieved when she saw me. "Good," she said. "You're here. Maybe you can explain things to them." "Explain what?" I wondered, but I just nodded and said, "Sure." We sat at the dining table again, the same one where applause had drowned me out months earlier. Papers were spread out now. Bank statements, loan documents, notes scribbled in the margins. My dad launched into it immediately. "We need to restructure some things," he said. "And because you're listed, we need your cooperation." There it was again. Listed. "I need to see everything," I said calmly. My mom frowned. "Eddie, this is stressful enough. Let's not make it harder." "I won't sign or agree to anything without seeing everything," I replied. Silence. Lily rolled her eyes. "You're being difficult," she said. "This affects me." "I know," I said, meeting her gaze. "It's been affecting me for years." My dad pushed a folder toward me. "Just review it quickly," he said. "This is mostly procedural." I opened the folder and flipped through it slowly, deliberately. I asked questions. Specific ones. Questions that made my dad's answers trail off. Questions my mom tried to redirect. Questions Lily couldn't answer at all. By the time I closed the folder, the mood had shifted. "We'll need more time," my dad said stiffly. "Yes," I agreed. "You will." That night, I stayed in my old room. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt ready. Over the next few weeks, I followed up. In writing, I requested full disclosures. I set boundaries. I stopped responding to emotional appeals and only addressed facts. Each message I sent was calm, professional, impossible to twist. Behind the scenes, I consulted the legal clinic again. Then a real attorney, recommended by a professor who'd taken an interest in my situation. I didn't tell my parents that part. There was no reason to tip my hand. What they didn't realize was that the document I'd almost fully revealed months ago wasn't just symbolic. It was leverage. It outlined rights they'd never considered I might exercise. Rights that, once activated, couldn't be put back in the box. The final piece of the setup fell into place when Lily sent me a message late one night. Just a few words. "I didn't know they used you like that." I stared at the screen for a long time. I typed back, "Neither did I." At first. She didn't reply. And in that silence, I understood something important. This wasn't just about being overlooked anymore. It wasn't even about favoritism. It was about accountability. About consequences finally catching up to decisions that had been made comfortably, carelessly, under the assumption that I would always absorb the impact quietly. The stage was set. Everyone was in position, whether they knew it or not. And the next move wouldn't be loud or cruel or rushed. It would be precise. But that moment hadn't arrived yet. The final meeting didn't happen at the dining table. That felt important. My attorney suggested neutral ground, and for once, my parents didn't argue. Stress had stripped them of their usual confidence. They were tired, cornered, no longer in control of the narrative they'd curated for decades. We met in a small conference room downtown. Beige walls, water glasses no one touched, a rectangular table that made it impossible for anyone to sit at the head. Lily arrived late, eyes rimmed red, hair pulled back hastily. My parents were already there, whispering to each other in clipped tones. When I walked in, conversation stopped. I took a seat, placed my folder on the table, and waited. My dad cleared his throat. "We just want to get this resolved," he said. "As a family." My attorney glanced at me, then nodded once. "That depends on what you mean by resolved." The documents came out slowly, not all at once. My attorney laid them out like stepping stones, each one revealing a little more of the truth my parents had assumed would never surface. Co-signed liabilities, joint registrations, a refinancing maneuver from years ago that relied on my credit history, another one that quietly shifted risk without shifting benefit. My mom kept shaking her head. "We didn't think." "That's the problem," I said calmly. "You didn't think I'd ever look." Lily stared at the papers, then at our parents. "You told me everything was handled," she said. Her voice wasn't angry. It was hollow. "You told me Eddie wasn't involved." My dad looked at her, panicked now. "It was temporary. Just paperwork." My attorney slid one document forward. "Paperwork has consequences." Here was the moment. The one I'd imagined in fragments during sleepless nights. But when it arrived, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt inevitable. "I'm exercising my right to separate," I said. Effective immediately. My mom's face went pale. You can't do that. I can, I replied. And I am. The separation triggered a cascade. Assets had to be reassessed. Liabilities redistributed. The safety net my parents had quietly built by leaning on my name snapped back into its original shape, leaving them exposed in ways they hadn't planned for. Lily's condo became unsustainable. The assistance my parents had promised her evaporated under legal reality. They couldn't prop her up without risking themselves further. The choice they were finally forced to make was the one they'd avoided my entire life. They had to pick honestly. They couldn't. The fallout wasn't explosive. It was slow and deeply uncomfortable. My parents downsized within 6 months. Not because they were destitute, but because they no longer had the margins they once enjoyed. Conversations with extended family shifted tone. Whispers replaced praise. The story they told about themselves quietly unraveled as people began asking questions they couldn't answer cleanly. Lily moved out of the condo and into a smaller rental. We didn't speak for a while after everything settled. When we finally did, it wasn't to argue. I really didn't know, she said one afternoon over coffee. I thought you just didn't need anything. I nodded. I didn't need what you were getting. She winced, accepting the truth of it. We didn't become close overnight. We didn't need to. What we built instead was something more honest, less performative, less dependent on borrowed stability. My parents tried, in their own way, to reframe things. My mom sent messages about missing me. My dad talked about fresh starts. They wanted reconciliation without reckoning, peace without acknowledgement. I didn't give them that. What I gave them was distance. And in that distance, I thrived. The consulting work turned into a long-term contract. Then another. My research took off in ways I'd never predicted. I moved into a better apartment, one I chose. I traveled for conferences. I spoke in rooms where people listened. I stopped feeling the urge to explain myself. 1 year to the day after the graduation dinner that started everything, I received an award from my department. There was a small ceremony. Nothing fancy. My advisor shook my hand and said, "We're lucky to have you." I went home that night, sat on my couch, and thought about applause. About how loud it had been for my sister, how quiet it had been for me, and how little it mattered now. The last conversation I had with my parents was brief. My mom asked if I'd come home for the holidays. I said no, not unkindly, just clearly. "We're proud of you," she said, almost as an afterthought. "I know," I replied, "but that's not what I needed." I hung up and didn't feel guilty. Because revenge isn't always about taking something away. Sometimes it's about taking yourself back. About refusing to be the invisible foundation holding up a structure that never acknowledged your weight. They built their world assuming I would always stay quiet, always absorb, always adjust. They were wrong. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't burn bridges for spectacle. I simply stepped out of the role they'd assigned me and let gravity do the rest. And for the first time in my life, the applause I heard wasn't borrowed. It was earned.